The lawyer slid a $1 bill across the table, said the diner on the fork stretch was hers, and her Uncle Wendell laughed so hard he had to set down his coffee before the ink was even dry. What none of them understood, not Wendell with his new cufflinks, not his wife Carol already spending the house in her head, was that the cheapest thing in that room was the only thing worth having. The dollar in Della Hartley's hand was the best trade anybody made in Halsey, Tennessee that morning. They had the math backwards. They would have a whole season to find it out, and the answer was waiting for her under a floor none of them ever thought to lift. Here is what the family had forgotten about Della. For 8 months, ever since the neon out on old Route 70 West went half dark and the griddle finally went cold, she had driven the 19 miles past the Pigeon Fork crossing every single Sunday. She let herself into a diner that served nobody. She flipped the open sign anyway. She brewed 1 pot of coffee and she set a single slice of buttermilk pie on the counter, third stool from the end, where her grandfather Earl had sat 40 years and sworn the road would come back someday. The road never came back. Della came back. Every Sunday while the rest of them stayed in town and waited on a dead man's money. She told herself it was for Earl. She did not yet know she had been standing guard over anything more than a memory. The reading happened in a back office off the courthouse square in Halsey, a low room that smelled of copier toner and a coffee pot somebody had left burning since dawn. Mr. Hatcher, the lawyer, read it in the flat voice of a man who had watched 100 families come apart over less. The house on Cedar Street to Wendell. The 2 savings accounts, just over $81,000 between them, to wee Wendell. The timber tract off Bottoms Road, to Wendell and Carol, jointly. Each line dropped like a coin into the same deep pocket, and Wendell nodded along like a man hearing his own name called in church. Then Mr. Hatcher came to the diner, Earl's Diner, out on the fork stretch, deeded to Della Hartley for the sum of $1. Wendell lost it. Wendell. He laughed until the chair creaked, until he had to set the coffee down, until Carol was patting his arm and laughing with him. $1, he said, wiping his eyes. Lord have mercy, does she have to pay it? Tell me she has to come up with the actual dollar. Mr. Hatcher said the estate would cover it. Wendell decided that was the funniest thing he had heard all year, because Wendell already had the part that mattered, or believed he did. A developer out of Knoxville wanted the fork stretch acreage for a new interstate ramp, and Wendell had shaken on it over stakes back in March. He had borrowed against the Cedar Street house to carry the deal until it closed. He had spent the money in his head a dozen different ways. Handing Della the building was the cream of the joke to him, the punchline he could not stop telling. He kept the land. He gave the girl 40 years of grease and a roof that leaked. Wendell called that fair because men like Wendell have always preferred words that come wearing a necktie. Carol leaned in and said it loud enough for the room. Take some pictures before you sell the scrap, honey. For the memories. She smiled when she said honey. Carol could fit more cruelty into that one word than most people manage in a whole paragraph. You know the kind. The relative who mails a sympathy card and an invoice in the same envelope. Nobody at that table could have told you why Earl kept the place open as long as he did. The diner had not turned a real profit since the interstate opened and strangled old Route 70 back in the 80s. Earl paid the property tax himself every year, close to $2,000, on a building that fed a handful of regulars and a lot of ghosts. Sentimental, the family said, and moved on. Della had wondered about it for years. She had filed the question away, with all the other things about her grandfather she had run out of time to ask. When it was done, Mr. Hatcher slid a brass ring of keys across the table to follow the dollar. It's a property, he said, and there was something almost careful in how he said it. It comes with whatever's in it. Wendell snorted. What's in it is a busted Frigidaire and 40 years of grease. Della closed her hand around the keys. They were still warm from the lawyer's pocket. 6 keys on a loop of baling wire, and she knew every door they opened. She had been opening them every Sunday for 8 months. She did not give Wendell the argument he was fishing for. That was the thing about Della her uncle had never bothered to learn. She had spent 4 years waiting tables at the Shoney's on the bypass, and 2 more running the morning shift, and she knew exactly what a room was worth, and exactly when to stop talking in it. She stood, thanked Mr. Hatcher, and walked out into the grey light of a Halsey afternoon with $1 and 6 keys. Wendell caught up to her in the gravel lot, jingling his own keys, feeling generous the way a man feels generous right after he thinks he has won. No hard feelings, Della. Tell you what, you get tired of paying tax on that dump you call me. I'll take it off your hands. He said it like a favour, clearing the whole stretch anyway. Clearing it for what, she asked, though she already knew. Progress, sweetheart. They're running a ramp through the fork. 60 days, it's all dozers out there. He patted the hood of her truck twice, the way you pat a dog you do not much care for, and walked off whistling. Della watched him go. She did not know yet that the dozers would never turn a single shovel of that ground. She did not know that in 3 months she would be standing in a county hearing room in front of every smirking face from that reading, holding the one thing that would put the laugh back in their throats sideways. That afternoon she only knew she was tired and broke, and the owner of a diner nobody wanted. The drive out to the fork stretch ran 19 miles of 2-lane the county had stopped pretending to maintain. Old Route 70 West, unspooled past dead motels and a Gulf station, with the pumps pulled out like bad teeth, a road the interstate had left for dead and the maps had mostly forgotten. Past the Pigeon Fork crossing the blacktop, bent the way it always had, and there it sat. Earl's Diner. Alone at the curve, a long aluminum box with a row of windows gone gold in the late sun, and the sign over the door that had glowed Earl's in red for 40 years. Now it read ER. The 2 L's had gone dark 2 winters back, and nobody had climbed up to fix them. Danos Tsuinoi. She let herself in through the kitchen door, the one that stuck on the bottom corner, and always had, loyal in the aggravating way old buildings can be. Inside, the cold held the smell of the place, under glass. Cold griddle grease, scorched sugar, coffee gone to tar in a pot nobody had emptied. Under all of it, faint the linseed oil. Earl had rubbed into the counter every closing night for 40 years, so the formica at the third stool had worn pale and soft as a river stone where his forearms used to rest. She did what she came to do. She flipped the breaker, and the lights stuttered on. She filled the urn and set one pot to brew. She found the pie in the cooler where she had left it the Sunday before. Buttermilk store crust because her own never set right, and she cut a clean slice and laid it on the counter at the third stool from the end. Then she stood in the empty diner her grandfather had left her for $1 and listened to the coffee tick into the glass. She sat down on that third stool herself, the one with the cracked red vinyl Earl had patched with careful electrical tape. When she was small, he used to set her there with a saucer of pie and let her work the register while the truckers teased her. My business partner, he would call her, dead serious, to anybody who would listen. She was 7 years old. He let her keep the drawer balanced to the penny and bragged on her every time it was. Della had her own math now, and it was not kind. She had $213 in a checking account and a truck with a transmission that slipped in second gear. She had given up the apartment in town back in March to help cover Earl's hospital bills. The ones the family decided afterward were her contribution, and not a debt anyone owed back. She slept on a fold-out at a friend's place, off Bottoms Road. She owned a diner. She could not have told you how she was going to keep the lights on in it past July. She could not have told you why she kept coming either. Not for the regulars. They had scattered years ago. Not for the money. There had never been any. She came because somebody ought to, and because the only person who ever told her she was worth more than this town, gave her credit for, had sat at that counter, and now he did not. Earl had been particular about that building in ways that never quite added up. He let the roof go, and the booths split their seams, but the floors he kept like an altar. The pantry floor most of all, wide pine boards he oiled by hand, and would not let a soul drag a crate across. Hollis Pruitt, who cooked Earl's line for 30 years, used to say Earl loved that pantry floor more than he loved most people. Everybody laughed when he said it. Earl never did. The letter came that Thursday, forwarded to the fold-out off Bottoms Road in Earl's own hand, mailed before he passed and held back by the lawyer's office until the reading was done. The envelope was soft from handling. Inside was a single sheet, and on it, in the cramped pencil print Della had seen on 40 years of order tickets and grocery lists, her grandfather had written her 4 lines. I didn't leave you a diner, girl. I left you the only floor worth standing on. Count the boards. Della read it 4 times. She turned the page over. The back was blank. Count the boards. It meant nothing to her, and it would mean nothing for weeks. She set the letter on the counter beside the cold slice of pie, under the dark sign that read E. And she looked across the empty booths to the closed pantry door at the back of the kitchen, and the cold pine floor on the other side of it that her grandfather had oiled by hand and let no one cross. She had no notion at all that the old man had just handed her, in 4 pencil lines, more than the house and the accounts and the timber the rest of them had spent the whole morning carving up. The floor was already hers, she just had to learn how to read it. She came back on a Tuesday because Sunday had started to feel too much like grief, and Tuesday felt like work. And work was the one thing Della Hartley had always been able to lean on, without it giving way under her. She brought a box of contractor bags, and a flat of cleaning rags, and the kind of resolve a person manufactures when the alternative is sitting still with their own thoughts. If the diner was hers, then she was going to know exactly what hers amounted to. She was going to put a number on it, even if the number broke her heart. The morning came in cold and white through the row of windows, and the place looked smaller in that light, the way buildings do when you mean to take inventory of them. She started where any honest count starts, at the register. The old machine was a National, heavy as a car battery, its keys gone yellow as old teeth, and the drawer still slid out with the same brass complaint it had made when she was 7, and her grandfather let her balance it. She emptied the till of its $40 in change, wiped down the rubber mat, and went to clean the nook the register sat in, the cramped shelf built into the counter where Earl had kept his receipt spike, and a coffee can of pencils, and a transistor radio that only got the AM gospel station out of Cookville. Her rag caught on something behind the shelf. A lip. A seam in the wood that did not belong. She would have missed it 100 times. She had missed it 100 times every Sunday for 8 months, leaning right over it to flip the radio on. But she had her fingers on it now, working the rag into the gap out of plain habit, and the habit turned into a question, and the question turned into both hands. The back panel of the nook was not nailed, it was fitted, a little tongue of pine set into a little groove, sanded so close that grease and time had sealed the line of it, nearly invisible. She pressed the bottom edge the way you press a sticky cabinet, and the panel rocked, and then it came loose into her palms like the building had been waiting to hand it over. Behind it was a hollow the size of a bread box, and in the hollow sat a tin. It was an old loose-leaf tobacco tin, the red paint gone to rust at the corners, the lid pressed down tight. Her hands were not quite steady when she lifted it out. It had weight to it, a shifting weight, the sound of small, hard things sliding. She set it on the counter beside the cold register and worked the lid with her thumbs until it gave with a breath of trapped air that smelled of metal and old paper. 2 things lay inside. The first was a key, brass long in the shaft, the head worked into a clover shape, heavier than any door key in that building and a good deal older than most of them. It was the kind of key that opened something that mattered, something a person meant to keep. She had never seen it before in her life. The second thing was a piece of paper folded into a tight square, soft at the creases from being folded and unfolded by a thumb that was not hers. She knew the hand before she had it all the way open. The cramped pencil print, her grandfather's whole heart squeezed into block letters, because he never trusted his cursive to be read. You found the first door, girl. Good. The key's no good to you yet, so quit trying it on everything you see. You will know the lock when you have counted right. Don't tell Wendell. Don't tell the bank. Don't tell a soul who wears a tie to a funeral. She read it standing up, and then she read it sitting down on the 3rd stool. And then she held the brass key in one hand and the note in the other, and she did the thing she had not let herself do at the reading, or the burying, or any minute since. She put her forehead down on the cool worn formica where his forearms used to rest, and she stayed there a while, and the diner kept its own counsel around her, the way it always had. That was how Hollis Pruitt found her when his truck crunched into the gravel. He had seen the lights, he said, coming back from his sister's place out past the crossing. Hollis Pruitt was past 70 now, narrow as a fence rail, with hands that had flipped 500,000 eggs on that line and still moved like it. He had cooked for Earl 30 years, and he had not set foot in the building since the griddle went cold, and Della watched him come through the kitchen door, the one that stuck, lift it by the knob on reflex the way you do for a door you have known your whole life, and stop dead in the middle of the floor, like a man walking into a church he used to believe in. You opened her up, he said. It's mine now, Della said, for $1. Hollis Pruitt let out a sound that was not quite a laugh. I heard. The whole town heard, the way Wendell's been telling it. He came to the counter, and his eyes went to the slice of pie she had set out that Sunday, and not yet cleared, gone to a hard amber curl under its dome, and something moved in his face. You've been keeping his stool. Somebody ought to. Somebody ought to. he agreed, quiet like she had answered a question he had carried a long way to ask. Then he saw the note on the counter, and the tin, and the brass key in her hand, and the quiet went out of him all at once. He picked up the note without asking, and he held it at arm's length, and then close, and his lips moved over the pencil letters. When he set it down, his hand was not steady either. "That's Earl's hand," he said. "Lord, that's Earl's hand to the comma. He wrote out the specials board every morning of his life in that same fist. I'd know it in the dark." He looked at her, and there was something working behind his face, some old thing surfacing. "What's it say to do?" she told him. "The key that was no good yet. The counting. The line about ties at a funeral." Hollis Pruitt listened with his jaw set, and at the end of it he laughed, but it was a wet kind of laugh, the kind that has grief sitting right underneath it. "Banks," he said. "You want to know about Earl and banks? The man would not put $1 in one. Carol used to needle him over it at Thanksgiving. All her talk about interest and CDs and letting your money work for you. Earl would just butter his roll and say, 'Money doesn't work, Carol. People work and money hides.' He shook his head. 30 years I cooked his line and he paid me cash out of a coffee can every Friday. He used to say it to me when we'd close up. 'Hollis,' he'd say, 'a bank can fail and a lawyer can lie and a deed in a courthouse can grow legs. But a floor stays where you nail it.' He loved that pantry floor like it was kin. Wouldn't let me drag a flour sack across it. I thought he was just an old man with a thing about his boards." Della had stopped breathing somewhere in the middle of that. She set the brass key on the counter between them, and she said the only practical thing her shaking head could hold. "The note says I'll know the lock when I've counted right. So first I find what this opens." And for the next hour, the two of them went through the building trying it. They tried it on the front door deadbolt, and the kitchen door, and the storeroom. They tried it on the cash drawer, and the old grey safe under the prep table that turned out to hold nothing but Earl's expired business licence, and a church key, and a photograph of Della at 7 behind the register, grinning, the drawer open in front of her. They tried it on the breaker box and the cooler padlock, and a strongbox-looking thing in the office that was only a recipe file. The brass key fit none of it. Not one lock in the building would take it. It slid in nowhere, turned nothing. And by the end, Della was standing in the middle of the kitchen with the useless, beautiful key in her fist and the first real crack of despair going through her, because she had let herself hope, and the hope had walked her straight into a wall. "It doesn't go to anything," she said. "He left me a key to nothing." Hollis Pruitt was standing in the doorway of the pantry. He had been quiet a minute, looking in at it, at the wide pine boards Earl had oiled by hand, gone the soft gold of old honey in the grey light. When he spoke, he did not turn around. "Della, I never told you why he kept this place open." Something in his voice made her stop. "The family says he was sentimental." "The family," Hollis Pruitt said, "couldn't find their own behind with a road map and both hands." He turned around. "I'm going to tell you a thing he told me once. The one time after a bottle of Christmas bourbon, and made me swear on my mother I'd keep it. She's been dead 6 years, and Earl's in the ground, so I reckon the swearing's run out." He came back into the kitchen and put his old hand flat on the prep table to steady himself. "Back in the early 80s, when the interstate came through and killed this road, the land out here went to nothing. Nobody wanted a single acre of the fork stretch. You couldn't give it away. An Earl who had no money to speak of, who paid me out of a coffee can, Earl quietly bought it. 60 acres. The whole bend, both sides of the crossing, all the way to where the timber starts. Bought it over a few years off folks who were glad to be shut of it, paid in cash. And he did not put it in his name, and he did not put it in the bank's name, and he did not let one single lawyer file it where Wendell or anybody else would ever think to go looking." His voice dropped. He put it somewhere safe. His word. Somewhere a man in a necktie would walk right over and never see. The kitchen had gone very still around the two of them. "Hollis," Della said. "Wendell sold that land." He shook hands on it. "The developer. The ramp. He borrowed against the house to carry the deal." Hollis Pruitt looked at her, and slowly, the corner of his mouth came up, and it was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a man watching a long arithmetic finally come around to its answer. "Then Wendell," he said, "sold something that was never his to sell, and he borrowed real money against it, and he has got no earthly idea. He let that sit. Earl knew that ramp was coming someday. He read the same county papers everybody read. He held this land 40 years. On a road nobody drove, paid the tax out of his own pocket on a diner that lost money every quarter, and the whole time it was never about the diner. The diner was the lid on the jar. Child, your grandfather didn't leave you a greasy spoon. He left you a vault and made it look like a loss so nobody'd ever try the door. And there it was, the thing none of them had understood at that table in Halsey, the cheapest thing in the room being the only thing worth having, laid out plain in a cold kitchen by an old man who had loved Earl Hartley, enough to keep his secret 6 years past the grave. The diner was a vault. The brass key was no good yet because she had not found the lock, and the lock was not in any door in this building because Earl never trusted doors. He trusted floors. Della turned and looked into the pantry, at the wide pine boards going gold in the dying light, the boards her grandfather had oiled by hand every closing night for 40 years, and let no living soul drag a crate across. I didn't leave you a diner, girl. I left you the only floor worth standing on. Count the boards. She walked into the pantry. The air in there was colder, close, smelling of oiled wood and old flour, and the faint sweetness of 40 years of sugar dust worked into the grain. She got down on her knees at the threshold, where the pine started, and she put her hand flat on the first board, the way Hollis Pruitt had put his hand on the table, to steady herself against what she could feel coming. The wood was smooth and cool and solid under her palm. She pressed it. It did not move. It was nailed where Earl had nailed it, exactly as he said a floor should be. Count them, Hollis Pruitt said from the doorway. Very low, like a man in church after all. Go on, count them out loud the way he'd want. Della Hartley laid her hand on the first board, and she counted. 1. She moved her hand to the next, the seam of it tight and true under her fingers. 2. Outside, far off down old Route 70 West, a truck that was not a truck she knew came up the dead two-lane toward the curve, slowing, its tyres sounding loud in all that quiet, and neither of them heard it yet. 3. 4. The board lay flat and true under her hand, fitted so close to the fifth that she had to feel for the seam with her fingernail, and there was nothing in it but cold pine and the long memory of her grandfather's oil. She moved on. 5. The fifth was the same, broad and honest, nailed down hard the way Earl had sworn a floor ought to be, and she pressed it with the heel of her hand, and it did not so much as breathe. Hollis Pruitt stood in the doorway with his cap off and held against his chest, and he did not say a word now, because there was nothing left to say. There was only the counting. She slid her hand to the next board. The light had gone the colour of weak tea across the pine, and somewhere out past the windows the slow truck had stopped its sound, or she had stopped hearing it, the way you stop hearing your own pulse when you are listening for something underneath it. Her palm came to rest on the sixth board, and the sixth board was wrong. She knew it before she knew why she knew it. Her hand had passed over 5 boards that were all of a piece, all the same width, all run the full length of the pantry floor, from the threshold to the back wall, and this one was not. This one was short. It started where the others started, but it ended early, a clean crosscut maybe 4 feet in, where no board in an honest floor had any business ending, and beyond the cut a second short piece carried onto the wall, 2 boards where the others were 1. And the oil on it was darker. That was the thing her eye had caught and her mind had not yet named, the way the gold of the wood went deeper here, richer, the look of a thing that has been handled, lifted, set back down, and oiled again and again by the same thumb over the same 40 years until it wore a shade the rest of the floor would need another lifetime to reach. The nail heads sat proud of the surface, just barely, just enough that when she ran her fingers across them, she felt them snag. 4 square old-fashioned cut nails that had been driven and driven again so many times they no longer bit. They only rested in their holes like buttons in a coat. "Hollis," she said. Her voice did not sound like her own. "It's this one." He came across the kitchen quick for an old man and got down beside her on his bad knees with a grunt, and he put his own hand on the board, and she watched his face do the same thing hers had done, the slow understanding rising up through it. "He cut it," Hollis Pruitt said softly. "All these years. He cut himself a hatch and laid it so true you'd never see it unless you were down on the floor with your nose to it, counting, which is exactly what no man in a necktie was ever going to do." He looked at her. "Get me that flat bar off the prep table. The pry by the wall." She fetched it, a short blue steel pry bar gone silver at the tip from use, and she put it in his hand, and then she took it back, because this was hers to do and they both knew it. She worked the thin end into the seam at the cut where the short board met its neighbour, and the gap took the steel, the way a lock takes the right key, and she leaned her weight on it. The old nails let go without a fight. They had been letting go for him for years. The board lifted at one end with a dry, small sound, a creak and then a give, and she set the bar aside and got her fingers under the lip, and raised it the rest of the way by hand, lifting it up and out, and laying it over onto the good boards beside her, and then the short piece behind it the same way. And the cold of the crawl space came up into her face, smelling of earth and dust and dry timber, and 40 years of dark. Down in the joist bay, sitting on a bed of clean dry sand someone had poured to keep the damp off it, was a box. It was steel, grey, the size of a cinder block and the shape of a small footlocker. The paint chipped at the corners to bare metal, and the metal gone the dull no colour of an old tool. A military thing, or a bank thing, from a time when both made things to last. There was a hasp on the front, and a lock set into the hasp, a squat brass cylinder lock, older than Della and newer than the diner, and it had been kept oiled too, because when she reached down and brushed the dust from it, the brass came up dull gold under her thumb. Her heart was going so hard she could feel it in her wrists. She got both hands around the box and lifted, and it was heavy, far heavier than its size, a dead solid weight that did not shift the way the tin had shifted, and she brought it up out of the floor and set it on the pine boards between her knees. She took the key out of her jacket pocket, the brass key with the clover head, the one that had fit nothing, the one that had turned in no door in the whole building, and made her say out loud that he had left her a key to nothing. Her hand shook. Hollis Pruitt put his old hand on her shoulder, just rested it there, the way a man steadies a thing he loves so it will not fall. She fit the long brass shaft into the brass lock, and it slid home to the hilt, smooth like it had been cut for it. Because it had been, and she turned it. It turned. The bolt drew back with a single heavy click that she felt in the bones of her hand, and the hasp sprang up, and the lid came free. You will know the lock when you have counted right. She had counted right. She lifted the lid. The hinges gave a long, low complaint, and stood the lid up open against its own stiffness, and the last of the daylight reached down into the box, and Della Hartley looked at what her grandfather had spent 40 years standing guard over, while the whole county laughed at him for a stubborn old man who would not close a diner that lost money. On top there was a flat packet wrapped in waxed butcher paper, the kind off the roll by the slicer, folded and tucked the way he folded a sandwich to go. Under that, when she lifted it out and her fingers were clumsy at the tape, was a thick band of certificates, heavy cream paper printed in green and black, banded in paper bands, gone brittle and brown. And across the top of them, in a hard engraved hand, ran words she half knew from old movies and never once from real-life bearer, the sum of payable to the holder, and there were more of them than she could count at a glance. A brick of them, a fortune folded flat and quiet in a box under a floor. Beneath the certificates lay a long fold of stiff paper, blue-backed, the kind a courthouse keeps, and she opened it and saw the surveyor's plat printed there, the bend of the fork stretch drawn out in fine ink, the acreage written in, along the lines, and the county recorder's stamp pressed into the corner, with a date and a book and a page, the proof that this was no copy, and no draft, and no wish, but the recorded original, the deed itself, filed and stamped and entered into the permanent record of the county years gone by. 60 acres, both sides of the crossing, all the way to the timber, and the name on the deed, the name the land had been put into and titled and recorded under, was not Earl Hartley, and was not Wendell Hartley, and was not any company a man in Nashville had ever heard of. It was a trust, the Hartley Family Trust, and clipped to the deed was the trust itself, a sheaf of typed pages with a lawyer's blue cover, and she did not have to read all the lawyer words to find the one line that mattered, because he had found it for her. He had drawn a soft pencil line under it the way he underlined the day's special on the board. The sole beneficiary of the trust, to whom all property held therein shall pass, was named on that line in type, and beside it, in the margin, in the cramped block pencil print she would have known at the bottom of a well, her grandfather had written it again in his own hand, the way a man writes a thing he wants to be sure of, the way a man signs what he means. Della Hartley. Her own name, in his hand, under the floor. She made a sound she did not plan to make and pressed the back of her wrist to her mouth. The waxed packet had come open in her lap while she stared, and inside it was the last thing, A single sheet folded once, and she opened it with the deed papers shaking in her other hand. And there it was, the rest of what the first note had started, finished now in the same pencil, waiting 8 months in the dark for her to count her way to it. Everything under your feet is yours, girl. It always was. I bought this dirt back when it was worth nothing, and nobody wanted it. And I held it through 40 years of being called a fool. And I put it down here where they would walk over it every day of their lives and never once kneel to look. Because the ones who kneel are the ones who keep showing up. And that was only ever going to be you. They will tell you the land was sold. It was not theirs to sell. Don't argue with them, Della Hartley. Don't raise your voice and don't cry in front of them. And don't let that bank man rattle you. Just bring the floor. The floor is yours and the floor will say so. Stand up now. Hollis Pruitt had read it over her shoulder, his lips moving, and when he got to the end of it, he sat back on his heels on the cold pine, and he put his cap over his face with both hands, and his shoulders went once, and he made no sound at all, and Della let him have it, because 30 years was 30 years, and he had kept the secret 6 of those years, past the grave for a man he loved. When he lowered the cap, his eyes were wet, and his voice came out rough and certain. 2 million, he said. More. The land alone, with that ramp coming, the land alone is more than the house and the accounts and the timber, and everything else they sat at that table, and carved up between them, and it was never in the pot. It was never theirs to fight over. It was under the floor the whole time the lawyer was sliding you that dollar bill. He shook his head slow. Wendell shook hands on this. He borrowed against this. He spent money he hasn't got. On land he hasn't got. And he has got no earthly idea that the deed to it has been sitting in a box under your pie counter, recorded with your name on it, since before your grandmother passed. Out in the gravel, a truck door slammed. They both went still. Della heard it now, the engine she had stopped hearing, idling out front, and the slam, and then the scuff of boots coming up the lot, more than one pair, and the clink of something metal, and a man's voice saying a number to another man, a measurement. A casual working number called out flat across the parking lot of a place its owner thought she had just inherited for free. She closed the box. She did not rush it. She lowered the lid and pressed the hasp and turned the brass key and drew it out and put it back in her jacket against her heart. And she lifted the box down into the floor and set it on its bed of sand exactly where Earl had set it. And she fit the shortboard back into its place and then its neighbour and pressed the proud old nails down into their worn holes with the flat of her hand until the seam closed and the floor was only a floor again, gold and quiet and lying. Then she stood up and she brushed the dust off the knees of her jeans, and she walked out through the kitchen and the dining room she had kept swept for 8 months, and she opened the front door of Earl's Diner and stepped out into the cold blue end of the afternoon to see who had come to measure her land. There were 2 of them. A young one in a quilted vest was driving wooden stakes into the shoulder grass along the fork stretch, a bundle of them under his arm tipped with little flags of orange plastic that snapped in the wind, and he was setting them in a line that ran from the crossing straight up the road and right across the gravel mouth of the diner lot, as if the building were already gone. The older one stood by a tripod with a survey instrument on it, sighting through it down the road, and he straightened when the door opened and touched the brim of his cap. Friendly enough. A working man's job. Afternoon, he said. Didn't figure on anybody being out here. You with the family? I'm the owner, Della said. That right. He said it the way men say it when they have been told different. Well, we won't be in your way long. Just shooting the centre line for the new interchange. Meridian Land's got the whole fork stretch under contract, this lot included, so. He shrugged. Not unkind, a man relaying weather. They'll send somebody about the building. I guess they'll want it down before the road crew mobilises, but that's above me. He glanced at the half-burned neon, the dark windows, the one slice of stool-side history she kept behind the glass, and something almost like apology crossed his face. Shame. Looks like it was a nice little spot once. When does it go before the county? Della asked. He blinked at her. The road? Commission votes the rezoning and the right-of-way. Thursday week, down at the courthouse in town. Public hearing, but it's a formality. Whole thing's already shook hands and signed, far as anybody's saying. You're, the gentleman handling the family end, Mr. Hartley. He's been down there twice already smoothing it. He bent back to his tripod. Be a different road out here come spring, I'll tell you that. Won't know the place. No, Della Hartley said, and she looked past him down the dead two-lane to the bend at Pigeon Fork, where the orange flags were ticking in the wind along 60 acres of dirt that a stubborn old man had bought when it was worth nothing and hidden under her feet. I don't expect they will. She went back inside before her face could tell him anything, and she let the door close on the cold, and she stood in the quiet of the diner with Hollis Pruitt watching her from the kitchen doorway. And for the first time since the lawyer slid that dollar across the table, she was not grieving and she was not afraid. She had 11 days. She had a floor. And she had a hearing to go to. The 11 days went by the way water moves under ice, slow on the surface and quick underneath. Hollis Pruitt pressed her to hire a lawyer of her own, and she told him no, because she had read the trust pages by lamplight 4 nights running until she knew their shape. And a man who builds a thing 40 years ahead of its need does not leave the finish of it to a stranger. She did the one thing the note had pointed her toward without ever saying it plain. On a grey Tuesday, she drove the 17 miles into town to the county courthouse and stood in line at the recorder's window behind a man paying off a lien. And when her turn came, she gave the clerk the book and the page Earl had pressed into the corner of the plat in his hard, small hand. The woman went back into the stacks and returned with a bound ledger the size of a feed Bible, and laid it open on the counter and turned it so Della could read. There it was, inked, stamped, dated, entered into the permanent record of the county, a full year before her grandmother passed. The Hartley Family Trust, 60 acres on the fork stretch, both sides of the Pigeon Fork crossing, running back to the timber. Della did not ask for a copy. She had the original under her floor. She only wanted to see with her own eyes that the book in the courthouse said the same thing the paper in the dark said, and it did, line for line, and she thanked the clerk and walked out and sat in the cold cab of her truck, a while with both hands on the wheel, breathing. Thursday broke hard and bright over Halsey. She went out to the diner before light and let herself in, and crossed the dining room she had kept swept through all those empty Sundays, and she knelt on the pantry floor one last time, and counted with her finger, more from habit now than need, one board and the next to the 6th, and worked it up and brought the steel box out of its bed of sand. She took the rolled plat and the blue-backed deed and the lawyer's trust with her name underlined in Earl's pencil. The banded certificates she left lying where they were. She had no use for a fortune today. She wrapped the papers in the same waxed butcher paper he had wrapped them in, pressed the board back down into its worn nails, and stood up in the grey kitchen and pulled on her denim jacket and her mustard wool beanie against the cold. Then she drove into town with the roll of paper riding the seat beside her, like a passenger she had waited her whole life to carry. The commission met in a low brick annex behind the courthouse, a room of folding chairs and a long front table and a flag gone limp in the corner. And it was fuller than such a room usually was because everybody on the fork stretch knew the road was coming and had turned out to watch it made real. Della took a chair in the back row. Up front, on an easel, a man from Meridian Land had stood a big glossy rendering of the new interchange, the ramps drawn curving and green, a fuel plaza and a truck lot laid out clean, and where Earl's diner stood in the living world, there was on the drawing only a smooth grey rectangle marked Future Commercial Pad. Wendell Hartley sat in the second row in a good canvas jacket with Carol beside him in her church coat, and a step below them sat a heavy man with a folder balanced on his knee that Della took for the bank. They were all easy with one another, laughing low at some small thing, the way people laugh when the hard part is behind them and only the signing is left. The chairman read the item out, rezoning of the fork stretch frontage to highway interchange use, and approval of the right-of-way and the purchase of the parcels needed for it. Meridian Land the buyer, the Hartley parcel the largest piece. The Meridian man rose and talked for 10 smooth minutes, jobs and tax base, and a dead road brought back to life, and he thanked the family for their vision and their cooperation, and Wendell lifted 2 fingers off his knee in a small gracious wave, and a few people clapped. "This is mostly a formality," the chairman said, not unkindly, looking out over his glasses. "Contracts are signed and the financing's in place. But it's a public matter, and the law says we hear the public first. Anybody care to speak to it before we vote?" For a moment nobody stirred, and the chairman lifted his gavel, and then Della Hartley stood up at the back in her beanie and her jacket, and walked the centre aisle to the little podium with the roll of waxed paper in her hand. Wendell turned and saw her, and his face did a thing she would remember a long while. a flick of irritation smoothed over fast into a fond and tired patience. The look a man gives a child who has wandered in among the grown people talking. "That's my niece," he said to the room. "Easy," turning so the commissioners could watch him be gracious about it. "She's been keeping Earl's old coffee shop running out there. Honey, this is about the land. You don't need to be up here for this." "I know what it's about," Della said. She did not raise her voice. She set the roll on the podium and peeled the waxed paper back with hands that did not shake now, and she lifted out the blue-backed deed and the trust and carried them not to Wendell, but up to the long front table, and laid them down in front of the county clerk who sat at the chairman's elbow among the record books. "I'd like you to pull deed book 41, page 209, she said to the clerk, "and read out who the fork stretch is titled to. All 60 acres of it, before you vote to buy it from him." The room took on the particular stillness of a room where something is about to go wrong for somebody. The clerk looked at the chairman, and the chairman looked at the Meridian Man, and the Meridian Man looked at Wendell. And Wendell laughed. One short laugh. The very laugh he had laughed at the will, reading with his coffee cup in his hand. "Now hold on," he said, getting to his feet. "That ground came down through the estate. I'm the executor. It's all been through probate. This matter is settled." "The house went through probate," Della said. "The accounts went through probate. The diner you slid across the table to me for $1 went through probate." She looked at him then, and only at him. "The land never did, because it was never his to leave. He put it in a trust before he died, and he recorded it in this building, and it has been sitting in that book down the hall the whole time you were out on the fork stretch, promising it to these men." The clerk had already gone to the shelf. She came back with the heavy ledger and set it on the table, and turned the pages, and ran her finger down and stopped. She read it out in the flat, careful voice of a woman reading a public record. The date, the grantor Earl Hartley. The grantee the Hartley Family Trust. The 60 acres given by metes and bounds, and then the line that mattered. The sole beneficiary of the trust, the one to whom the whole of it would pass. Della Hartley. The clerk read the name and looked up over the top of the book, not at Wendell, and not at the man from Meridian, but at the young woman standing in nobody's spotlight, in a wool beanie, at the front of the room. And something moved in the old woman's face that was very close to a smile. Then the room came apart, not loudly, but the way river ice comes apart, all at once and almost without sound. The Meridian Man sat down slowly and opened his own folder and began turning the pages fast, hunting the name on his own contract. And his face when he found it told the whole of it, because the name his company had signed was Wendell Hartley, and the name in the county's own book was not. The bankman with the folder on his knee had gone a bad grey and was no longer leaning warm toward anybody. Carol had her hand on her husband's sleeve and was saying his name low, twice a question with no good answer. And Wendell stood there in his good jacket in front of the whole fork stretch with his mouth working, because he had borrowed against this land and spent the borrowing, and he had shaken hands on the sale of it, and he had laughed at a girl over a folded dollar bill, and every last piece of that had just been laid open on a table by a clerk reading aloud from a book. "There has to be some mistake," he said, but he said it to a room that would not lift its eyes to him. "Earl never said one word to me about any trust." "He said it to me," Della answered. Quiet. "He just took the long way around to do it." The chairman set his gavel down without ever using it. He took off his glasses and pressed the bridge of his nose and looked a long moment at the bright interchange on its easel, the green ramps, the smooth grey pad drawn over the top of a place where men were at that hour drinking nothing because no one was there to pour it. Then he looked at the Meridian Man. "This commission can't buy a right of way from a man who doesn't hold the title," he said, "and we surely can't lay a road across a trust we never knew was filed." He turned to the clerk. "Strike the purchase from the item. Table the rezoning until the ownership is settled," which every soul in the room understood to mean it was finished, because the ownership was not tangled in the least. It was the plainest thing in the book. It had only been kept under a pantry floor 6 years, waiting on the one person who would get down low enough to count. The Meridian Man found her in the gravel lot afterward, his glossy board tucked under his arm, his voice gone careful and respectful, the way men go careful around money they have just realised they were standing next to. He had a number for her. He said it low, the figure for 60 acres with an interchange coming. And it was more than the house and the accounts and the timber tract her family had carved up among themselves, more than the whole of it stacked together. He held out his card and said his people could have papers drawn by Friday. Della looked at the card and did not take it. "It isn't for sale," she said. He thought he had misheard and said the number again, a little higher, in case the trouble had only been the number. "You're not hearing me," she said. "And there was no heat in it. There's no road going through my grandfather's floor." And she stepped up into her truck and pulled the door shut and left him standing in the gravel with his drawing of a place that was never going to be. By the end of that week, the orange flags were gone from the shoulder grass all along the fork stretch, drawn out of the ground one by the same young man in the quilted vest who had driven them in, the stakes pulled and bundled and thrown in the bed of his truck so that the shut filling station and the old feed store and the 2 farmhouses at the bend that had all been marked for the ramps stood in the lengthening light unmarked again and let alone. And on a Sunday in the green part of the year, Della Hartley drove out to the fork stretch and did not set a cold slice of buttermilk pie on an empty counter. She unlocked the door and propped it wide to the warm air and lit the griddle, and Hollis Pruitt tied an apron over his belly and took his place at the grill where he had stood 30 years. And the first eggs went down hissing into the heat. Out front, the sign warmed up letter by letter, the neon hole now, no dark gaps left in it, and it read Earls, and under that, smaller and newer and bright, Della Hartley Proprietor. The coffee went on. The morning light lay warm on the gravel where they had laughed.